But so I guess for the first question, what exactly do you mean by one, subjectivity, and two, the destruction of subjectivity? How is it impossible? How is it possible for and what are we saying when we say that subjectivity, in a sense, is being destroyed in modernity?
Well, subjectivity is something which, for me, is possible, okay, but only in the very specific sense of limitation. There's one part
Hmm.
near the very end of that book where I mention that you can define being as limitation within this sort of ontology, because insofar as the ancient Greek question, why is there being instead of nothing, can be rephrased in terms of this ontology. It's really, what are the limits which allow there to be a being that I'm dealing with? Okay, and one of those limits actually is the subject. If you think in terms of maybe the four limitations that I described, you have the transcendental limitation, which is the condition of the possibility of something appearing within a certain layer of experience. You have the five layers, the mythical layer, then the transcendental limitation is it appears as an event within a narrative. You have the systematic layer, in which the transcendental limitation is that it appears as a value within a Gnostic system. Then you have the ergonic layer, in which it's appearing as, I say, a countersense object. The memological layer, it's appearing as a geometrical shape. The somatic layer, it's appearing as the presence of the crucial resource. So those are transcendental limitations. The transcendent limitations are each one of those layers' relation to the next one. The problem of the mythological event is that it's ambiguous. And you solve this ambiguity by turning it into a value of a system in which the value is no longer ambiguous, it's clear, but the system as a whole is inconclusive. You think of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. A formal system, no matter how complicated it might be, can never be both complete and consistent. It's either one with the other. So that's the limitation, really, of the Gnostic layer. Really, is the next layer is its own transcendent limitation. It resolves that inconclusiveness by becoming the conclusive form of an object. But the limitation in that case is that it's impure. You have kind of a halfway clear manifestation of the logic of fossil fuel modernity in, say, the countersense object of a student loan, for which no matter how much you pay into it, you go deeper. You not only never get out, but you actually go deeper into debt. And that is something which doesn't really make sense until you overcome the impurity of the countersense object by getting the purity of the deep mean. Now is a geometrical shape. Now it's given much more clearly what really is presupposed in the countersense objects of, say, the fossil fuel burning machine, which actually depletes the resources rather than resolves the problem of resource depletion. For example, we talk about electric cars as a great example of this right now in the United States. Well, solution to high gas prices is just cars that also use some other form of fossil fuels, right? So we have the deep meme underlying these as the more pure form, but now the limitation is that it lacks the presence, which you only get when you get to the soma. So where does the subject fit into this? Well, the subject is simply the immanent limitation, for which no matter what's given within the five layers, okay, and no matter which somatic context it is, be that the hunter-gatherer worldview, the agrarian worldview, the fossil fuel, the one thing which can be found, no matter which layer or which somatic context you're dealing with, is the subject. And the subject is not a positive givenness, okay, but it's also not simply the negation of someone like Hegel or Jean-Paul Sartre, etc., or even Zizek. It's rather than neither positive nor negative limitation of the subject. And technology destroys that for the same reason that it negates all of the other structures of limitation. I've mentioned when you get to full-blown technologization, as envisioned by people like Jacques Ellul and Ted Kaczynski, or even Julius Evola. For Evola, technology and mechanization is simply the negation of the hermeneutical ability to interpret the spiritual symbols of the world of tradition. You have this purely negative negation of that hermeneutics, I think, within traditionalism also. But certainly when you get to Kaczynski and Ellul, there's an idea that the kinds of subjects who have to live under modern technology are people who leave all of the thinking to the technological system itself as a sort of systematic rationalization, hardwired to replace spontaneous instinctual movements within nature with precise forms oriented towards maximizing efficiency, predictability, etc. And at that point, you have to destroy the other structures. You have on the smartphone screen, for example, something which really is not mythology anymore. It's not appearing within an event that can be hermeneutically interpreted as narrative. You have the destruction of the system also, in which you no longer try to have a grasp of the Gnostic essences of, say, the Platonic world of ideas, or even beyond that, any one of the true mathematical systems. For Descartes, they're innate ideas, but they're still grasping the numbers as Gnostic essences. Rather, in modern technology, you have redundant flows of electrical energy reinterpreted as a pseudo-numerical binary signatures. And those are then reinterpreted in a yet more redundant way as the contents which manifest themselves on the computer screen. So you lose all of these dimensions, and it's natural that the immanent limitation of the subject would also disappear.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested in that, this idea of the immanent limitation of the subject. I'm gonna like try and situate this in sort of a Žižekian context, and I'm referring to Žižek's Hegel and a Wired Brain, because I think maybe in your response you could go deeper into what it means to abolish the limitation of the subject, specifically in how it would relate to this idea. Because I don't know if you read the book, but the idea is essentially for Žižek. As you know, Žižek understands the subject as the void of self-relating negativity, and his idea is that in the wired brain, what we lose to the wired brain is our substantial contents of the subject. That would be thoughts, emotions, passions. We lose that to the singularity who is able to penetrate into these contents. But what the singularity can never penetrate into would be the subject itself, the void of the subject. So Zizek's idea is that if the singularity is possible, which he has his doubts over, the subject would not only be not be more powerful, but it would be even more deprived of power, and it would almost be, to use your terminology, which I think they're different contexts, so they're not exact, but it's almost like the subject is reduced to the bare level of a limitation. So it's not that the subject has is fully in control of the entire universe in the singularity. It's rather that the subject has lost its substantial being over to the singularity and now remains as the self-relating subject. So maybe in your response, you could also go into how your understanding of subjectivity, as you mentioned, how would it differ from a more Hegelian or Žižekian understanding of the subject as this void of self-relating negativity, etc.
It's a excuse me, very interesting question. One thing I would like to clarify, though, is when you speak of the singularity, is that a reference to Ray Kurzweil?
Yes.
Okay, well, the thing that Ray Kurzweil is talking about, as interesting as it might be to speculate on philosophical grounds, is actually an ecologically impossible object for the reasons that Ted Kaczynski has detailed. If you reach a point where the computers actually would be smart enough to do things like, for example, allow us immortality on a materialistic level, the fantasy of Ray Kurzweil is you'll be able to leave behind the limitations of this body to assume a glorified robotic body and then zoom off into outer space. But the question is, you get to live forever. So what do you actually get to do with all that time? People like skeptics will make this remark sarcastically about heaven too. There's a lot of details in even the Bible itself about the pains of hell, and far more within the history of Christian literature since then. But there's remarkably little said about the joy of heaven. And Dante's own response at the very end of the Divine Comedy is, well, the greatest joy of heaven is you get to gaze on the appearance of God. Right. And something like this you see even within Hinduism. There was the Swami Prabhupada, who noted in his lectures on the Bhagavad Gita that the Hindu idea of God as a void of formlessness really should be contrasted with his own idea that the highest goal within Hinduism is not to merge with the void of that which in Sanskrit is neti, neti, not this, not this. Rather, it is to contemplate the absolute greatest form of Krishna himself. So you find this idea within traditional religions that ultimately there's not much that can be said about heaven except you get to see the grace. Well, for Kurzweil, really, it's even more redundant than that. The only thing you really get to do within heaven is the same thing you already get to do in this life, but without the negative side effects. You get to binge on hard drugs, for example, without having to worry about overdose, etc., because you have a glorified robotic body. The ultimate form you get to gaze on for Ray Kurzweil is you just get to have sex with whatever female celebrity you'd like to. His own example is Marilyn Monroe. Somebody can fill the blank in with their own personal choice, but it's basically a perverse redefinition of this idea that, well, at the very end, you get to gaze on the ultimate form, right? But it's in a purely sexually perverted manner. And this is something which Kurzweil maybe can speculate on in a consumerist sense about all the sort of things he'll get to consume, really, in that state. But the thing he's talking about is ecologically impossible because, as Ted Kaczynski noted, if the computers actually became that intelligent, they would long since have brought about human extinction, either as a result of damaging the ecosystem to the point that these physical bodies, before we can get the glorified ones, no longer able to meet their basic survival needs, or through concluding on a purely rational level that the humans who had long since lost their ability to compete with the electronic brains no longer serve any function. So for me, the very question of the singularity is talking about an ecologically impossible object. And really, for me, that's just another way of saying that this seems to make sense because it's a countersense object. You don't see really the contradiction between these goals. The computer is powerful enough to give us what we want, but also so powerful that they no longer need us. So for me, the singularity really is just another manifestation of fossil fuel-based thinking.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And I think the thing is with Zizek's book there, he's very skeptical of the idea. He thinks that Ray Kurzweil in particular is pretty kooky, but I think the idea is it was more like a speculative idea of what it would be to become immersed in the singularity.